The smoke rises in a thin, greasy ribbon against the blinding blue sky, carrying a scent that tastes like ash and iron. On the white sands of Thrinacia, Odysseus wakes to the smell of roasting meat. He stands on the ridge, wind whipping his salt-crusted cloak, looking down at the camp where his men huddle like wolves around a kill. The sacred herds of Helios have been butchered. Can the wit of the great wanderer outrun the gaze of the sun, or has the hunger of his crew finally severed their fate? The journey here was paved with the warnings of ghosts. Before the ship tasted the surf of Thrinacia, the blind seer Tiresias spoke from the grey mists of the underworld. He had seen these kine of the sun, immortal beasts that neither breed nor die, grazing in eternal peace. "Leave them untouched," the ghost commanded, "and you may yet reach home." Circe had echoed this, her eyes wide with a terror only immortals feel for the folly of men. Odysseus carried these prophecies like heavy stones through the wine-dark sea. Odysseus intended to bypass the island entirely. He stood at the stern, hand white-knuckled on the steering oar, and commanded the men to row past the cliffs. He spoke of the omens and the price of sacrilege. But the spirit of a man is not made of iron. It is made of flesh, and flesh tires. Eurylochus, his second-in-command, challenged him. His voice was cracked with exhaustion, speaking of trembling limbs and the cruelty of a captain who would deny his crew the solid earth after a month of swells. Odysseus saw the rebellion in their eyes, a quiet, desperate mutiny. He relented, but only after binding them with a great oath. They would eat the grain of Circe, but never touch the herds of the sun. They landed under a waning moon, hauling the ship into a sea-hollowed cave. For the first few days, the protocol was observed with the discipline of veterans. They prayed and watched the magnificent cattle, white as clouds with horns like silver, roam the meadows. But the discipline of the soul is a fragile thing. Then, the south wind began to blow. It was a hot, relentless gale that pinned them to the shore for a month. The ship's stores dwindled to nothing. The wineskins grew sour. Odysseus watched the transformation of his men, a forensic descent into the madness of the gut. He saw leather belts notched tighter. He saw them hunt the shore for meager birds and lean fish that could not satisfy the hollow ache. The wind became a mocking howl, a constant reminder of their slow, starving rot. The ribs of the men pushed against their skin, like the hulls of wrecked ships. Their eyes sank into their skulls, burning with a feverish light that saw food in every shadow. Hunger is the greatest of all traitors. It strips away the warrior and leaves only the beast. It dissolves oaths sworn in the light and replaces them with the logic of the dark. Seeking solitude to pray, Odysseus climbed to a high ridge. He begged the Olympians for mercy, but they sent only a deep, unnatural sleep. While the captain slept, Eurylochus gathered the men. He did not speak of glory, but of the forensic reality of their end, the tongue swelling and the mind turning to ash. He proposed a desperate bargain. They would kill the finest cattle, sacrifice to the gods, and vow to build a temple to Helios once they reached Ithaca. It was the logic of the doomed, a moral compromise designed to mask a theft. They convinced themselves that a future temple could pay for a present sin. The slaughter began with the frantic energy of the starving. Blades bit into white necks, and sacred blood spilled into the thirsty sand. They did not have barley to sprinkle, so they used oak leaves, a pathetic imitation of the divine protocol. They flayed the hides and carved the thighs, offering the fat to the empty sky. The fires were lit. The smell of roasting fat, which should be the scent of civilization, became the scent of a funeral pyre. The men tore at the meat with bloody fingers. As the meat began to sizzle, the world recoiled. The struggle was no longer against hunger, but against the physics of the divine. The meat on the spits began to low, a moan from the roasted muscle vibrating through the wood. The hides, flayed and dead, began to crawl across the sand like great pale slugs. It was a cinematic horror, a manifest sign of their sacrilege. The men driven by a madness that transcends fear, continued to gorge. They chewed the meat of gods while it screamed in their mouths. Odysseus woke to the smell of the end. He reached the camp and saw the carnage, the crawling hides and the hollow-eyed men gorging on their own execution. The realization shattered him. This was never a test of strength against a monster. It was a test of endurance against their own nature. He had failed to save them from themselves. He is the master of many ways, but there is no way to bargain with a consumed sacrifice. He cried out to Zeus, but the sun had already demanded blood for blood. For 6 days, the men feasted on the meat of the gods. They were like men walking in a dream, knowing they were dead, but unable to stop the motion of their jaws. On the 7th day, the wind finally shifted. They launched the ship, leaving the blood-stained meadows behind. But they did not sail as victors. They sailed as ghosts. The symbol of the lowing hide remained in their minds, a sound that echoed louder than the waves. The air was heavy with the static of approaching judgment. Once the land was lost, a black cloud rushed across the sea. The wind they had prayed for returned as a vengeful god. A west wind struck with the force of a falling mountain, snapping the forestays of the mast. The timber fell, crushing the helmsman's skull. Then came the thunderbolt. Zeus flung his lightning, a white-hot spear of pure judgment. The ship shattered, the air filled with sulfur and scorched timber. The hull groaned as it splintered into 1,000 pieces of driftwood. The men were tossed into the sea, bobbing like petrels in the wake. One by one, they were pulled down into the dark. The very meat that gave them strength now weighed them down, a physical debt being collected by the deep. They looked to Odysseus one last time, eyes filled with the realization of their folly before the water took them. Odysseus alone remained, lashing the mast and the keel together. He clung to the wreckage, a solitary figure in a vast, uncaring chaos, adrift on the tide. The lesson was etched in the salt on his skin. What carried him through was not pride, but the grim acceptance of fate. He had tried to lead with words, but the belly proved stronger than the soul. The sin that doomed the crew was the belief that their need justified breaking the world's order. History remembers Odysseus for his cunning, but on Thrinacia, he learned that the most dangerous monsters are not those with 6 heads, but the hunger that lives within the hearts of men. The sea is a patient creditor. Ahead, the mists of Ogygia wait, where a goddess will test whether the man who survived the hunger of the body can survive the hunger of the soul. History remembers him for his public traits, but in this trial, he learned that nature always collects its price. Next, a new storm rises, the test of a man who has lost everything but his name. Walk with us through the old stories. Subscribe to Saga Weaver, where ancient warriors face impossible choices.